The PlayStation 2 is the best-selling video game console of all time, having sold over 155 million units worldwide. With a life spanning over 13 years, this is the story of the Sony PlayStation 2. So to learn about the story of the PlayStation 2, we have to go back to gain some context. So let's go right back to the start. Sony was founded in Japan in 1946 by Masaru Ibaka, originally as an electronics shop, and produced their own electronic devices such as tape recorders and radios. Sony soon realized their growing business needed to go global, and in the 50s entered the US market to big success. The company became known for their quality, and as such were able to charge higher prices for their products than the norm. So we see Sony's first entry into the gaming landscape when they worked together with Nintendo for the first time, and this was in 1988. This was after employee Ken Kutaragi went behind Sony's back to agree to produce the sound processor for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. Now, going behind Sony's back nearly got him fired. However, those within Sony soon realized the potential of this, and they kept him on. He's now often referred to as the father of PlayStation. At the start of the 90s, there was a real desire for bigger games and better graphics. This was in the middle of a generation of consoles though, and so CD add-ons looked like the way to go. With rumours of Sega producing their own Sega CD, Nintendo didn't want to be left behind. And thanks to their partnership already in place with Sony, they agreed with Sony that they would make the SNES equivalent of the Sega CD, and this would be called the PlayStation. As well as this, it was also arranged that Sony would be able to produce their own sort of games console, which would be an all-in-one SNES, including both the cartridge slot of the original and a CD add-on all in one package. One problem of this arrangement though had already begun, as the agreement meant that Sony would hold sole international rights to every game released on the CD add-on. This meant they had a relatively large amount of control over Nintendo. But by 1991, the agreement was still in place, and the PlayStation was set to be announced at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. As it got closer to the show though, then Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi became increasingly worried about Sony's leverage and pulled the plug on the partnership without consulting Sony. So they didn't actually tell Sony, and Sony began to hear rumors that Nintendo had gotten cold feet, and with only 2 days now to go until the announcement of the PlayStation, Sony frantically tried calling both Nintendo and Philips, but neither answered. Sony had to assume that it was just rumors, and so 2 days later at the Consumer Electronics Show, the PlayStation was unveiled. But at 9 AM the next day, Nintendo officially announced that they had cancelled their partnership with Sony and they would be signing with their biggest rivals, Philips. Those in the industry call it the greatest ever betrayal. Now, despite this, Sony were actually still open to working with Nintendo and still wanted to make the PlayStation. So it was agreed that the PlayStation would keep an SNES port and Nintendo would hold the rights and retain most of the profits. Development was deep enough that roughly 200 prototypes were made, one of which actually sold at auction for over $300,000 recently. But this agreement angered many within Sony, as Nintendo had stabbed them in the back, and a deal between the two could jeopardize Sony, especially with the power that Nintendo had in the deal. So in 1992, Sony decided to cut all ties with Nintendo. And after previously being laughed out the door by Sega for the Sega CD add-on, Sony had no ties within the video game industry, and it looked likely that this would be the end of their video game involvement. However, the man who got this all started, Ken Kutaragi, was adamant that Sony should continue, and after reminding the board of the humiliation they faced from Nintendo, the company began working on their own standalone console. In 1993, just a year after the cut from Nintendo, Sony announced to the world their plans, and in 1994, the PlayStation was released in Japan. It competed against the Sega Saturn, which released a week earlier, and thanks to Virtua Fighter, the Saturn was able to get off to a better start, but the PlayStation was selling better than imagined, especially considering the install base which Sega had at the time. In 1995, the PlayStation was released in North America at $299, $100 cheaper than the Saturn. Despite the good start in Japan, Sega were scared, and so decided to preemptively release the Saturn in North America. But this was with little warning, and so many stores weren't ready, and as such, the release flopped. 4 months later, the PlayStation released in North America and sold more units in 2 days than the Saturn did in 5 months. It was clear Sony were here to stay. Now, you're probably wondering where Nintendo are in all of this. Well, they didn't release their next generation console, the Nintendo 64, until late 1996, and as such, the PlayStation had already established a large install base, a vast games library, and were established in the industry. Even when the N64 released, PlayStation sales continued to grow. It all meant that the PlayStation won the 5th generation, and by a landslide. It sold for 102 million units compared to 32 million of the N64 and just 9 million of the Saturn. But how would they follow up? Well, now we're on to the story of the PlayStation 2. Work reportedly began on the PS2 as early as 1994 with the launch of the PlayStation. It was by 1997 that the press began reporting that Sony were working on a second PlayStation, which would include backwards compatibility, a DVD drive, and internet capability. Sony denied this to the press, but it was clear that something was coming soon. Chris Deering, then president of SCEE, said that those within Sony were anxious about a follow-up to the PlayStation, knowing that it would be incredibly tough to replicate its success. At the same time though, Sega were becoming desperate. After the flop of the Saturn, financial pressure was high and they needed their next console to succeed. As early as 1995, development began on their new console, and by 1997, the company began leaking information about their new console and games in an attempt to raise hype levels. Sega were pouring everything at this and spent up to $80 million on hardware development and $300 million on promotion. The Dreamcast was officially unveiled in May 1998. Being the first of the next generation, the Dreamcast drew significant attention and received a lot of pre-orders. But from this, problems began. Due to chip failure, many devices were faulty and Sega stopped pre-orders. The Dreamcast did release as planned in Japan, however it failed to capitalize on the high interest due to the shortage of stock, as well as that Sonic Adventure and Sega Rally Championship 2, which were supposed to launch with the console, were delayed, meaning only Virtua Fighter 3 was hyped at launch. Then before the North American launch, Sega were hit with another blow as EA announced they wouldn't be supporting the system. This was due to Sega flip-flopping around with the hardware, making it hard for the developers to work on. And this meant that instead of popular EA sports games, the Dreamcast had, well, Sega sports games. Despite this, in September 1999, the system launched to commercial success. It set sales records, but despite this, Sony still maintained 60% market share through the PlayStation's install base. And just 11 days after the North American release, at the Tokyo Game Show, Sony unveiled the PlayStation 2. Sony revealed that the PS2 would be able to render up to 16 million polygons per second, and this was compared to the Dreamcast's ability to render 6 million per second. Sony also confirmed the PS2 would be using DVDs, which could hold far more data than a Dreamcast's GD-ROM system. This also enabled backwards compatibility with the PlayStation, meaning the install base they had already worked so hard for wouldn't lose out. It also meant it was only the second mainline console ever to feature true backwards compatibility after the Atari 7800. To many, it looked like the Dreamcast was going to be obsolete just months after it was released. And hype for the PS2 was huge, and in March 2000, the console launched in Japan. Sales records were absolutely smashed, with the PlayStation pulling in $250 million on the first day, beating the $97 million record made on the first day of the Dreamcast. It was released in October in North America and November in Europe, and was met with just as much hype. The releases weren't plain sailing, however, as just like the Dreamcast, the PlayStation 2 was affected by shortages due to manufacturing delays, and many predicted this would help Sega as people returned to the Dreamcast, which had just received a price drop to $149 compared to the $299 of the PS2. However, this wasn't to be, as most decided just to wait or instead purchase a new, slimmer PS1, which became the best-selling console that Christmas. The PS2 was gradually more and more in stock and became arguably the most hyped product on the planet. It did something no other console had ever done before: reach all markets. With games for the casual and hardcore, all gamers were catered for, and the added media functionality through the included DVD player made non-gamers even interested. This was because standalone DVD players at the time were often more expensive than the PS2. The system continued to fly off shelves while Sega struggled massively, and in March 2001, Sega announced the discontinuation of the Dreamcast and pulled out of the video game console race. This meant that until late 2001, the PS2 was the only real option on the market, and its install base grew massively over this time. But then the PS2 faced its biggest battle yet with the releases of the Nintendo GameCube and the original Xbox. Many predicted that it would be a close three-way battle, with the Xbox significantly more powerful than the PS2 and having Halo, whilst the GameCube was the cheapest console and had the lure of exclusives such as Mario and Zelda. But that DVD functionality turned out to be key. The GameCube had no ability to play DVDs and the Xbox required an external adapter, and so neither of those two consoles really appealed to the consumer market. Sony were still worried though, and lowered the price of the PS2 to $199 and secured the exclusive rights to the Grand Theft Auto and Metal Gear Solid series. Another thing that sprang up around this time was online gaming, and the Xbox launched with heavy focus on it, something the PS2 hadn't. And once again, PlayStation tried to combat this by introducing the PlayStation Network adapter in 2002, and from then on, more of a focus on online gaming. Despite the launch of the GameCube and Xbox, the PlayStation 2 was still #1, and in 2002, PS2, the PlayStation 2 sold 25 million units. This is more than the Xbox or GameCube did in their entire lifespans. The PlayStation 2 continued to grow, and in 2003 saw the release of the iToy. This was a webcam for the PS2 which was used for games where you could use gestures to control, and this meant the good sales of the system continued, with 20 million sold in 2003. 2004 came along and Sony launched the PS2 Slim in midst of rumours of the next generation, especially regarding Xbox 360. However, despite the release of the PS2 Slim, these rumours along with manufacturing issues meant that sales fell to just 11 million in 2004, but this was resolved in the next year as sales went back up to 20 million in 2005. This was the year the Xbox 360 launched. From around 2004 to 2005-ish though, focus within Sony did shift away from the PS2, now towards the PSP and the PS3, but the PS2 remained popular even after the launch of the next generation. Even throughout the PS3 Xbox 360 era, the PS2 sold well, especially in less well-off countries, and it continued to receive support until it was officially discontinued in January 2013, the year the PS4 was released. The last game to be released for the system was FIFA 14, which was released on the PS2, PS3 and PS4, spanning 3 generations. In total, the PS2 sold 155 million units, making it the most successful game console of all time. So now the story's told, let's have a look at the consoles, the reiterations, the accessories, and of course the games. So if we start off with the consoles, first of all we have the original fat PS2. The standard colour was of course the classic matte black with the PS2 logo in blue, but there were loads more colours available of this massive fat PS2, and I'll list them off now. So we had ceramic white, light yellow, metallic blue, metallic silver, navy, opaque blue, opaque black, pearl white, sakura purple, satin gold, satin silver, snow white, super red, transparent blue, and also a limited edition pink. The console had 2 controller ports, which was actually criticised a little bit at the time, especially when the Dreamcast had 4, and it had 2 memory card slots. My favourite part growing up was always the PlayStation logo, which you could move depending on which orientation you had it, but overall the fat PlayStation 2 was very solid. But then we have the slim PS2 released in 2004, and this was so much smaller than the original. Honestly, it's incredible how they managed to get it that much smaller in only 4 years. The disc drive was a flapper top thing, so not as nice as the motored slot loading bay. This is kind of like the Wii Mini compared to the Wii. It featured an inbuilt Ethernet port, which was obviously good for the growing online gaming at the time, and unlike the original, didn't have an external power supply. So in all aspects, it was really an upgrade. So there were only actually 2 reiterations of the PlayStation 2, which you might have expected there to be a third, considering, you know, many consoles have 3 iterations. That's if we only include the mainline systems, though. There were 2 other quite special models. First of all, the PSX, which was released exclusively in Japan in December 2003. This was a digital video recorder and DVD burner in addition to being a PS2. It didn't sell well at all in Japan and was not released anywhere else. And then we have the PlayStation 2 TV, officially the Sony Bravia KDL 22PX300. It was released in Europe in 2010 and it was a 22-inch 720p TV. And like how many TVs had DVD drives, this had a PS2 console inside of it. But now let's move on to the controller. The original DualShock was released for the PS1 in 1997 and differed from the standard PS1 controller as it featured vibration feedback and analog sticks, and Sony stuck with these for the DualShock 2. The controller is pretty much identical to the DualShock 1, and thanks to backwards compatibility, well, they all use the same port, you could use all PlayStation 1 controllers on the PlayStation 2. There were a couple of differences though. All the buttons now were pressure sensitive, which was obviously great for racing games, especially with the triggers. So overall, the DualShock 2 was a great controller, so much so that the design has pretty much stayed the same in the whole way through PlayStation's lifespan. But now let's have a look at some of the accessories, and there were a lot, especially third-party knockoff ones, you know, thinking your companies like Mad Catz. A few official ones though included the previously mentioned iToy, the Buzz Buzzer, a DVD remote, and a Logitech wireless controller. There were loads of other ones though, such as dance mats, microphones, and of course steering wheels. But now arguably the most important part of any games console: the games. As far as I'm aware, the PlayStation 2 has the biggest catalogue of games of any console, with over 4,000 titles being released, and a staggering 1.5 billion games were sold on the system. I'll run through the best though. So of course we have to start off with the GTA series, and there were 3 games in the series released on the system: GTA 3, GTA Vice City, and the most famous, and in fact the best-selling PS2 game of all time, GTA San Andreas. All 3 of which were released first on the PS2 before later coming to the Xbox and Windows Windows. These games were groundbreaking for open world games. Then we have the Gran Turismo series, which was hugely successful on the PS1 and is continued over with Gran Turismo 3 A-Spec and Gran Turismo 4, two of the best racing games of all time. Of course, Final Fantasy appeared on the system with 10, 11 and 12 all releasing on the system. Tekken continued its success as it came over to the system with Tekken 4 and Tekken 5. The console also saw the birth of massively popular series Kingdom Hearts, Jak and Daxter, Ratchet & Clank, Devil May Cry and God of War. Other notable games include Need for Speed Underground, Simpsons Hit and Run, the Guitar Hero series, The Getaway, Spider-Man, Lego Star Wars, Resident Evil 4, Star Wars Battlefront and of course many others. The library on the PS2, due to how popular it was, is also filled by tons of shovelware and poorly licensed games, but it's still an incredible library with so much quality even to this day. It's definitely a console I would say is worth going and picking up. The games are so cheap if you go to somewhere in the UK like CEX or I'm guessing GameStop in America. Games are, they're dirt cheap and some of them are such high quality. But there we go. That is the story of how the PS2 became the most sold games console of all time. It is a true classic and will go down in history. Let me know your favorite memories of the console and if you think that 150 million number will ever be beaten. For more tech news, be sure to subscribe.